Good evening. All of you made the choice in this weather. Was it dry until this moment or no? You arrived wet. Yeah, I see. Okay, perfect. You all made the choice to go through the weather this evening to be here at Pakhuis de Zwijgen. My name is Peter Melis. I will do my best to moderate. Good evening. This evening, we will talk about solar radiation modification. Just as a starter, if you have the scale of, I heard about this term for the first time just now, so then you're, let's say, standing here. And if you're the true expert on this topic, so you invented solar radiation modification, then you stand here. So I will move along from here and just raise your hand if you feel comfortable with your position. Who is like an absolute beginner in this topic? Who feels like, oh, I barely heard the topic? Who feels like raising a hand? Yeah? Few hands go up? Yeah? Perfect. Welcome here. Who has a bit more background? Yeah? Yeah? Some more hands up. Perfect. In the middle, so in between a newbie and the expert. Yeah? Two more hands in betweeners. Nice. Then a bit more to the expert field. Who feels in this area? Yeah, of course. Yeah. That nice. Nice. I move further along. Who's the inventor here? No. Yeah, nice. Let's move to it immediately. Helene de Koning.
Hi.
When was that moment?
That was during one of the lead author meetings of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees.
We will get back to this later on. You were there when the term was coined. You're not looking happy about it. We will get to that later. Okay, so the program is called A Cold War on Global Warming. It's a program on the global governance challenges with solar radiation modification. So we won't dive into the technical side and all the variations on it, but it will really be an evening around the governance side. So what is it? It's a form of geoengineering in which sunlight would be filtered or reflected to outer space. So you basically prevent sunlight from hitting the Earth in some way or the other to counteract the greenhouse gases to build up. We will show a short clip just to get the evening started. It's from Tegenlicht. Who has seen Tegenlicht on this specific topic? Yeah, a few hands go up. So we will share a short clip from it. It's a nice watch if you want to see it later on. In that documentary from Tegenlicht, there you will see that not only philanthropists and geopolitical powers like the US and Russia are really intrigued by these techniques, but it's also entrepreneurs who discover new possibilities. And you see in this clip a few guys from the startup Make Sunsets, a company that already sells cooling credits for bringing sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. So let's watch this short clip.
They're so much fun. Do you want to let it go?
I'll let you do it.
3, 2, 1.
11:05.
11:05. Okay.
Technology got us into this problem, and technology will get us to muddle through it as it always has.
Yeah. Aren't you scared that you would accidentally cause any ecological disaster?
The world is doing quite a good job of intentionally causing an ecological disaster with our carbon-based geoengineering. What we're doing stays up for 2 years. It's the same thing that volcanoes output, and we have millennia of a natural record of what it does. So people are scared of new things until they become a bit more normalized, and this is, somewhere in that process of being normalized.
Sunscreen for Earth is the best way to describe it. Just put some on your skin and you don't get skin cancer. And so location and quantity matters. Obviously you don't drink the sunscreen. You just apply it as used.
Is het een probleem dat investeerders zich afvragen of dit soort technieken geld kunnen opleveren?
So, short clip from this documentary. For this evening, we have, let's say, 3 main questions we will investigate. First one is, did SRM, that's solar radiation modification, but let's use the acronym for the rest of the evenings, maybe a bit easier. Did SRM become an unavoidable topic for the climate debate? That's the first question for this evening. And the other one is, what powers push for SRM to become an inevitable part of the climate debate? And the last one we're going to investigate is, what kind of governance is needed to prevent it from happening in an ungovernable way, so that it really becomes ungovernable. We will do that with 2 panel rounds, with the same experts, and in between those 2 panel rounds we will have a guest through Zoom, an expert on this topic as well. She's at the moment in the UK, so she will join us from there. And we will start with, let's say, an introduction into the topic, which is kind of a scenario we will dive into. So how could it develop in the nearby future? The person who will do that is Jeroen Oomen. He did his PhD on geoengineering. He's an assistant professor at the Urban Futures Studio at the Utrecht University. And his research interests are climate policy, geoengineering, social theory, and specifically where it concerns questions of sustainability. So he will stay seated for a while, but shortly he will join also the stage. So we'll dive into the possible future of this topic.
It is the 7th of September, 2027. Spring and summer heat waves have torched the Indian subcontinent. With temperatures well over 50 degrees in the nation's capital since May, India has announced its intention to develop and implement its own geoengineering program. In a speech lauding the success of the Indian Space Research Organization, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, weakened by dissatisfaction in his heartlands, suffering under immense heat and drought, tells a room full of sympathetic reporters that it is time for India to take up the mantle of a global leader. In a belligerent speech, Modi accuses the West of deliberately slowing down the Indian energy transition. By limiting India's access to natural gas, the West forced India to remain reliant on coal. By skirting its responsibilities for historical emissions and by neglecting their financial responsibilities, the West blocked fruitful climate negotiations. By refusing to either temper its own resource use or let the rest of the world catch up, the West maintained colonial inequalities. By limiting technology transfer, the West and China privileged their own economic aspirations over the climate. Bharat, Modi's preferred name for India, will no longer stand for it. Bharat will go its own way. Modi insists in his speech that India can combat its heat waves using geoengineering technologies. In his new climate invention agency, Bharat, inspired by Boris Johnson's 2021's Advanced Research and Invention Agency, he will bring together his leading scientists, aerospace engineers, chemists, and applied physicists. Drawing on lessons learned in its Shukrayaan, Venus orbiter mission, and long-range ballistic missiles program, as well as its increasingly advanced climate science, India will find a technological solution for its heat waves, for its droughts. SEAP, as the acronym for the new institute is, will build a fleet of high-altitude aircraft capable of stratospheric cargo flights. Within 2 years, SEAP will run its first field tests. Within 5 years, the program will be operational. Although Modi doesn't really specify which technological approaches he will take, nor whether he has the actual strategic resources and infrastructure to get this off the ground, most experts expect SEAP to have some modicum of success, to focus on stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud seeding, and potentially marine cloud brightening. Given the involvement of India's spacefaring programs, mirrors in space or other outer space-based technologies are not ruled out. Modi's promise to use complex engineering promises to safeguard his inhabitants' livelihood is not new. India has a long-standing interest in cloud seeding to make rain. It also has a long infrastructural history of linking rivers, of other massive interventions aimed to control natural systems. But this is different. Political response to Modi's speech is vehement. Pakistan's president, responding to hardliners in his own government, accuses India of using the heat waves to further military Hindutva dreams. Chinese leader Xi Jinping, facing internal pressures due to an enduring economic slowdown, sends a small contingent of extra troops to the heavily contested border region as a show of force, saying India cannot and will not be allowed to experiment with the global climate. China will not allow it. US President Joe Biden, in a rare public appearance, the US will not stand idly by as India develops the capacity to influence the world's climate. I have personally authorized a research program to monitor Indian capacity and to develop US capacity. DARPA and NASA are on the case. Brazilian President Lula dos Santos, a progressive ally of Global South climate movement, is unequivocal. PM Modi's geoengineering program is the latest signal that climate politics is failing. Implicitly, though, he concurs with Modi's assessment that the issue lies with the West. A year later, 2028, sources close to the Prime Minister indicate that Modi's expressed interest in solar geoengineering was mainly a performance to placate his hardline followers in Uttar Pradesh, the hardest hit region in the 2027 heat waves. Climate control technologies are not meant to be implemented by Modi, but rather to signal action, to signal concern for his followers. Yet India's real intent doesn't matter. The genie is now out of the bottle. Despite the faux outrage in the media by other countries, several of them have indicated their interest in climate control measures. Pakistan has secretly, tacitly signaled that it will accept India's geoengineering program as long as vital operational information is shared, as well as all the military information. China, fearful of deadly wet bulb heat waves, and India have actually also started back-channel negotiations about the program. More problematically, however, is the indication from countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia that they too will implicitly accept India's geoengineering program. Because early indicators suggest that these countries are simultaneously considering long-term oil and gas and mining exploration on their territories in the order of 60, 70, or 80 years. 2029. Dire headlines warn of past tipping points. Parts of the Amazon rainforest are now beyond saving, as are parts of the redwood forests in Canada and Russia. Modi's BJP loses the election. With the return of the Congress Party to Indian rule, a semblance of Indian multilateralism returns too. It is unclear what this means for the geoengineering program. Will it be scrapped? Will it continue? For climate politics at large, these questions hardly matter. Increasingly, SRM seems like the only option, or is made to seem like the only option. After a decade of cultural and political struggle dominated by skeptical right-wing populists across the globe, dreams of material wealth, of eating steak and jetting across the world for a well-deserved holiday continue to wash over us via billboards, product placements, films, video clips, and social media. Material affluence as a cultural dream is non-negotiable. As Tejal Kanitkar and her colleagues showed in 2024, the non-negotiability of Western lifestyle even remains reflected in the IPCC reports, in its emissions pathways. In 2021, the US climate envoy, John Kerry, put it quite succinctly when he insisted, people don't have to give up a quality of life to cut emissions. According to Kerry, half of the necessary emissions cuts would come through technologies still to be developed and perfected. He closed with, that is just a reality. Modi's geoengineering program simply reflected that same belief, that same cultural pathways. People don't have to give up material aspirations to safeguard the Earth's temperature. 2030. CEOP continues. The Guardian reports that the USA and India were already in back-channel negotiations about India's program prior to Modi's speech. In exchange for full veto powers on the program, plausible deniability, and full access to data, the United States indicated that it might allow testing from its air bases across the globe, a capacity India would not have had otherwise. Highly classified joint test flights spraying aerosols in the stratosphere already occurred in 2026. There is no going back, it seems. The first contours of global climate interventions are taking shape. Two technologies will be the main focal point of testing. Marine cloud brightening on the board, bolstering reflecting cloud cover, and stratospheric aerosol injection, mimicking reflective effects of volcano eruptions. Both technologies have been researched seriously for decades, although there still has been very little by way of field testing. Both carry very significant risks. They may lead to unequal cooling across the globe. They may disrupt hydrological cycles. In the case of stratospheric aerosol injection, they might heat the stratosphere. They are not and cannot be an alternative to conventional mitigation. However, they are becoming so. Beyond these two technologies, India's geoengineering program also announced its intention to collaborate with NASA and DARPA in determining the possibility of mirrors in space. Space, after all, still sells the technological dream. Simultaneously, in some corners, economists are starting to float the idea of cooling credits. It was an idea that was around since 2015, 2019, but now they are taking it seriously. Offsetting your carbon emissions with solar radiation modification. 2032. A conglomeration of oil companies and fossil fuel producing countries starts a lobbying push for a radiative forcing standard. Carbon credits, universally accepted, they argue are not accurate enough because they will not take into account all the different ways in which humankind influences the climate. With a radiative forcing measurement instead, we could weigh cooling factors, such as geoengineering technologies or pollution, against warming factors, such as the greenhouse effect. Despite scientists continuing to insist that this would be a terrible idea, the radiative forcing standard immediately reignites debates about cooling credits, offsetting carbon emissions using geoengineering technologies. 2037. Between 2027 and 2037, the series of devastating heat waves, droughts, floods, and storms that prompted Modi's CEOP only intensifies. Although fossil fuels emissions have declined seriously and carbon capture infrastructures have been built up to a significant degree, net zero is still far out of reach. Due to a lack of technological support, and deliberate policies by fossil fuel producing nations, many countries in the global south are not able to leapfrog fossil fuels. 2 degrees as a climate target might still be feasible. Who knows? At the same time, popular support for invasive technological attempts to limit these climate damages, to limit the suffering, has increased considerably. In no small part due to lobbying campaigns by philanthropists, scientists, and fossil fuel interests. Stratospheric aerosol injection is rolled out on a global scale. The first reflective satellites have been built. Early testing is underway. 2050. Net zero has turned out to be a rather empty promise. Emissions remain roughly around 10 gigatons a year. Solar radiation modification is now an embedded political reality, used to stabilize the climate and to safeguard tipping points. Despite serious concerns about side effects, shifting monsoon patterns, and an ongoing tension between China, India, and the US about the control of these technologies, there is no going back. Having cooled the Earth by about ½ a degree, SRM is now locked in. Cessation of these technologies would lead to an abrupt termination shock, a rapid warming of the climate, as again you can see on the screen. This lock-in has huge political ramifications. Like the nuclear infrastructure developed decades earlier, state or corporate power over these technologies seems to be inevitable. In different ways, inequities, power imbalances are locked in. Where do we go from here? Back to 2024. In 2016, the late Steve Raynor lamented what he called magical thinking in the Paris Agreement. He said there's an unfounded and deeply embedded faith in technology to solve environmental problems. It's the kind of observation that I like to make, and I think it's a very important one that we need to keep in mind. In the face of such magical thinking, we tend to lose scientific nuance and scientific fear for these technological interventions that are hugely influential. And it quickly evaporates, and then we're talking about dreams of military might, of profits, of climate denial and delay. I just had one scenario in which I sped up a little bit the development of SRM, because I don't think anyone here in the room thinks, or at least hopes seriously, that in 3 years we're going to have a real SRM development program. But it's not impossible. SRM is hugely contested. Some of these proposals are clearly, for now, in the realm of science fiction. Others might be more serious, and they are becoming startlingly serious. So before I turn over to our panelists, who in many ways have much more deep empirical knowledge of what is happening in the world out there, I want to leave you with my key observation. It's very tempting to treat solar radiation modification as a technological approach to climate change. If we treat it as such, we're going to weigh its technical pros and cons, its climate benefits and risks. It's a tempting thing to do because it seems apt, but it's wrong. Because in the real lives of people, and especially in the real political world out there, as I tried to sketch in this scenario, it won't be just about climate. It will be about signaling something to your base, or it will be about signaling power to your immediate adversaries. So technologies don't stay mere technological solutions to isolated problems, however much we want them to. Instead, they translate into different concerns in different spaces. They become political dreams. So before turning over, I want you to remember that these technologies are already out there and that they're already being pre-packaged in a way for their adoption in the climate regime. And I think, and I hope that that is what the panel talks about today. All these different ways that these technologies are taking shape already without actually being out there. They can tell you about that much better than I can, so I'm going to stop it there and leave you with my favorite quote that I ever got during my PhD research from a PhD researcher at Harvard who was doing climate modeling. And this was in 2017, and she said, sometimes I feel like I'm working on the Manhattan Project because who knows what will happen with that technology. And I think by the day, that quote seems more prescient. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Jeroen Oomen. We will get back to you at the end of the program. So we continue. Welcome. Let's see. Just a short note. I asked in the beginning, how well known are you with SRM? If there's anything unclear, we will have experts here at the tables, and it might happen that they mention a term or like something that you're not aware of. What does it mean, right? So please raise your hand if it's going too much in depth or you cannot follow, so that we make sure that everybody can follow the discussion. So please raise your hand if there's anything popping up that's too difficult or you're like, what is that? So make sure you get yourself heard. Okay, let's switch here. Yeah, perfect. The idea is we're going to fill up those tables. So with 4 spots, we will have 4 experts joining me here at the panel. I will introduce them one by one, ask a short question, then another one pops up. So we fill them step by step. First one to get here, he is a policy advisor, natural resources at the Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management in the Netherlands. His name is Arthur IJs. So it's maybe a cheesy joke, but you're in water management, so maybe take care of some water here. So while I'll pour you some water, maybe as an introduction, what does your work consist of?
Well,
related to SRM, right? You do more than SRM.
yes. I work on polar matters in my family, but that's a whole different story. No, indeed, on this issue, the basic question that we ask ourselves in The Hague with all the ministries involved, and that's not just my ministry, but also foreign affairs and economic affairs and climate, is what the Netherlands' position on this is, and how do we envisage a future where we will have discussions on SRM. So we will need to prepare for that discussion internationally, and that means that first of all we need to develop a national view on this. And that's what we're doing.
We will dive deeper in it, but just a short answer. Do we have a position on it now? Is it clear what the position is?
Yes, we have a very basic position on that, which is that we are not in favor of SRM development, and certainly not of its deployment, at least until we have a global governance system, which is lacking, and which will take a while to be developed.
We will get to that topic later on. Perfect. Thank you, Arthur. Second expert joining us, she's a professor of social technical innovation in climate change at Eindhoven University of Technology since 2020, and a professor in climate change and system transitions at Radboud University. Helene Koning. Helene, we already had you briefly with the microphone there. You coordinate and wrote reports for the IPCC, so you've been really active negotiations, right?
Well, as an author, you actually write the report,
Right.
so you mainly assess the picture and summarize it. Getting a solution called it, and then in the end, you're part of the legal session with some of the sessions. Running negotiations between countries, countries for each other.
Yeah. So until the negotiations, you are part of it.
Yeah, well, during the negotiations as well, but then we are there as authors to make sure that what they agree is in line with the underlying report.
Okay, so that things don't get misinterpreted or
Yeah, so that the IPCC procedures are followed, which is that the summary for policymakers has to be in line with the underlying report.
Is there a lot of attention on SRM in these reports?
Not a lot, no. There's some, but not a lot. And especially in the summaries for policymakers, it's usually, sometimes it's one paragraph. It depends a bit on the report.
Okay. As well, we will get back to that. Next expert joining us is Aarti Gupta. She's a professor of global environment governance at Wageningen University and Research. Aarti, welcome. Perfect, yes, thanks for sharing the water. There has been a meetup, a Tegenlicht meetup here in January. Who has been at that meetup as well? We already spoke about the documentary, not at the meetup? Yeah. Perfect. You've seen Aarti there as well. Yeah, perfect. Aarti, you were there. Do you think that these events and documentaries, that they contribute to the discussion we need?
Well, since Pachals organized it, I think you hope that they contribute to the discussion we need. So yes, I think definitely the kind of attention the issue gets at such events is important. But of course, as Jeroen was also pointing out, it's particularly important if the technical is discussed together with the political and the governance aspects, right? And that was the start of the conversation. And the January event was more about the technical side, and there was a component which addressed the political and governance aspects. So I think particularly today is also a very crucial follow-up. Yes, because we are discussing exactly these very politically contested questions.
Perfect, nice. A final expert joining. She's a science journalist for NSA, and she writes about technology, sustainability, and also about geoengineering and solar radiation modification. Laura Wismans. So welcome, Laura. How many articles on geoengineering, SRM?
You asked me that at dinner. I thought 5 or 6 big ones, a couple of small ones. I don't know exactly.
First year, when was it?
2020.
2020.
Yeah, so I've followed it for more than 4 years now.
Do you have a position in the debate? And what is it?
Constantly changing position. Well, of course, I'm a science journalist, so we are talking here about the governance thing. And the more and more I read and talked with people about this topic, the more and more I realized how entangled it is. Because for a science journalist at NRC, like the UN assembly meetings and stuff, they're all at the foreign desk, not at my desk. I'm with the science. So it was a little bit divided, but the more and more, I think it's one topic. So that's why I decided also to write about the governance kind.
Yeah, yeah. We will start this panel with the inevitability, as it is named, in the creation of knowledge. So that when you create knowledge, it's inevitable that it will go on. It's somewhere in it, right? It's inevitable that it will continue. How do you perceive that? Will it get bigger and bigger?
I think everything you give water to blooms. So I don't know if that's a saying in English, but well, yeah, I think, and that's one of the main problems in this topic. I think the more and more you talk about it, the more realer it will become, and that's also something I'm thinking about as a journalist for NRC. Like, if I'm writing about it, more people will know about it. And what's my role in this then? Will I certainly don't hope to encourage all this, but yeah, I do want to inform the people that there are things going on right now, even if they're all far, far away from really happening, I hope. But yeah, that's also a concern in my daily work. Yeah.
Is your concern on also how it lands at the reader? What do readers do with the information?
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I don't know what they're doing with it. So that's not, I don't try to think about that a lot.
Helene, just when you entered, when I met you just before the event started, you shared that you also sometimes doubt by really joining these events because we talk about it.
Yeah, I'm glad Laura is asking herself these questions because I know not everybody does, but I very much do. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in this topic, yeah, since maybe 10 years or so, but at least since the 1.5 degrees report, 2017, we started writing that, and that, yeah, I realized just how, how every minute that basically you spend on this, you're not spending on mitigation and on the transitions that we actually need to enter. It's in a way a distraction of the real things we need to do.
And is the distraction
that,
getting bigger?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So with every moment that I spend on it, including this evening, I'm wondering, am I doing the right thing?
So it could be that halfway you just leave.
Yeah, like no, I decided to. No, I'm here now, so
yeah,
yeah. But that's I think it's a constant dilemma. If you're playing a role in this debate, and you described it as well, you have a responsibility, and how do you feel that responsibility? How do you take that responsibility?
And how did it end up then in the IPCC? Because you said you were there when it got coined the first time. How did it end up within the IPCC report?
Yeah, so IPCC assesses the scientific literature, right? So everything that's related to climate change, and SRM is part of that. So it's part of that literature. So IPCC needs to assess it. So usually it's a small part of assessment reports of the IPCC. I think the first time it appeared was probably 2007 or so in the AR4, maybe even earlier. I don't know actually if you know, but yeah. So around that time,
IPCC expert.
Yeah, before that time I wasn't involved either. And yeah, sort of how I sort of experienced it in the 1.5 degrees report, which is sort of a pretty major report released in 2018 on 1.5 degrees of global warming.
Yeah.
I was a coordinating lead author, which means that I co-led one of the 5 chapters. And actually, IPCC always operates from an outline. So as authors, you get like chapter titles and a couple of bullet points, and that's sort of that's what you need to assess.
That's your work. So
that's
go
your
ahead.
work. Yeah, it's approved by the governments. This is the outline. Yeah, and then you assess the literature, etc. And SRM was not in our bullets. Geoengineering was not in our bullets. Carbon dioxide removal was, but SRM not. But then when we looked at the author team, there was one author there who was actually an expert on SRM. So we're like, oh, okay, apparently we need to assess SRM. And by that time, there was quite a lot of literature already on it. At that time, it was still called solar radiation management.
Yeah, that's the old term.
That's the old term, yeah. So I was there in the room when we called it solar radiation modification, because I think we had another term, RDM or something, radiation management, and then.
But who makes the decision? Countries together make the decision. SRM will be in it then, or the author is in it.
Well, apparently the Bureau, which is the management of IPCC, decided that it was a good idea to assess this literature in the context of the special report on 1.5 degrees. So that's how we got this author in the author team. She was actually really good. She was a young Russian researcher. She's excellent, really good and very neutral person to assess the literature. She knew a lot about it, and she really tried to do a good job. So I was really happy with her. But that was a bit unexpected that we had to assess it.
Aarti, how do you look at these developments that SRM is becoming bigger in the scientific field?
Yeah, I think this question of inevitability is a very important one, and I think but it's a dangerous notion. I think that this is becoming inevitable because the discussion is growing, and I think there's a risk that this idea that contemplating SRM is becoming inevitable is almost like it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's my first instinct, is to say that if we think, that, well, there's talk about it, we need to talk about it, some research is happening, we need to consider this, and therefore we have no choice but to talk about it. So others join into the conversation, and I think that's dangerous, because
Why is it dangerous?
Well, I think we still have a choice, right? And I'm not suggesting that we don't talk about it, but I'm suggesting that this idea that it's inevitable, that this will become increasingly normalized, that it's okay that we need to consider it, that is, that's one of the motivations for taking a position in this space as an academic. Maybe you're aware, and I think some of those who were here before, I'm part of a group of academics that's calling for a non-use agreement on SRM, and maybe this will come up later. But part of the reason for that is this growing normalization of the conversation. And if that becomes, if that goes to a situation where we say, it's inevitable, and we all just have to engage because the genie is out of the bottle, I think that's risky, because we still have a choice. In this critical decade, in those few years left, in the various scenarios we can sketch out, it's not completely entrenched yet.
Do you also mean that the more we investigate it, the more likely it is that it will be deployed?
Well, there's the whole question of, yes, the more we talk about it, and there is that concern. When I first entered this space, I had a similar concern, like Helene was also mentioning, like you mentioned as well, Laura, that should we give more air to this? So we draw attention, no matter what we say, we draw attention. Maybe it's better not to. But in the process, now I've sort of, at this moment in time, I feel it's very important for me to be here or for me to be anywhere where this topic is discussed. So I will accept all invitations to talk about SRM, because I really feel like otherwise we leave the field free for those who are very interested in talking about, let's just do the research, and therefore the alternative perspective, maybe the political science, the governance perspective, that's often sort of an afterthought, because most of those who are saying let's do the research are natural scientists. They are invested in, professionally invested in this. They might be very well-intentioned scientists. So this is not some evil person hiding away somewhere doing some nefarious thing. But just to answer your question directly, I think doing the research is just this idea that let's research SRM does risk leading us down a slippery slope to technology development and to deployment. That is simply the case, and history tells us that as well.
Laura, you talk to a lot of scientists also as you work as a journalist. What do you see as the reason that scientists want to investigate this, that they really are into this topic of SRM?
Most people I think I talk with are really, really concerned, and the concerns on both sides of this field are quite the same, but the way they weigh the arguments is different. So I think they really want to bring down the natural hazards that are going are happening right now, and they say it's not like if it's a small chance that this could be a solution, why don't we research it and leave us with nothing?
Yeah.
And I think okay, I cannot say anything about that because that's a fair point, but I also know all these other concerns, and it's nice that Jeroen had his whole scenario played out, because I think most of the times you think about the scenario like, okay, one country wants to do it, but like there's a whole world after that, and I think that's the concerns are the same, but what do you do with it are different.
So if you have the inevitability of knowledge creation, it's unstoppable, right? Because these scientists are worried and they will continue researching it, right?
Yeah, and then at universities, it's very important to do your own research, to follow your own questions.
You have the freedom.
The academic freedom. Yeah, it's a really important thing in academics. So yeah, I think this will continue. The research will continue, I think. But yeah.
If you're wondering, is there any room for questions this evening? There is. We will move to that space a bit later, but first move to another inevitability part. That's the inevitability in which SRM is also discussed at international governmental bodies. And then there will be room for questions. So please hold your questions a little longer if you have them. Arthur, last March, there was a UNEP resolution. Let's first start with the basics. What is UNEP?
UNEP is the United Nations Environment Programme. That's the UN organization that deals with the environment.
There was a resolution put to vote that dealt with SRM. Can you briefly explain what was on vote?
Well, it has not been put on vote. It was a proposal from Switzerland together with a couple of other countries, and they proposed to agree to have a scientific expert committee looking into the topic that would be fed with information that UNEP would gather on the basis of submissions from countries, stakeholders, etc. And then those scientists could report and recommend things. Well, that resolution did not fly.
So what was the idea of the resolution? What was the aim for it then?
The aim is to have governance and to have a set of rules and at least agree about the basics. And the basics is not just about deployment, but it's also about how to do and whether to do research. Because let's not pretend that there's just this academic liberty of doing research. Yes, of course, there's academic liberty. We should cherish that also in the Netherlands. But we do have rules for doing research on chemical weapons, on human cloning, on whatever.
Yeah.
And we need to at least agree to what extent and in what way we can do research on SRM. So that was one part of it, and then you come to the deployment side, and that's a whole different debate.
What was the position of the Netherlands?
As I said in my introductory remark, the Netherlands is not in favor of the development of SRM technologies, nor is it in favor of its deployment. And it's for
but so
us,
the resolution sounds then really legit, right?
yes, we supported that resolution, but it was rejected by a group of countries led by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And it has been blocked to the extent where Switzerland decided to withdraw it. So it has not been put to a vote, and we are currently in the situation where we were before March, which is a governance sort of vacuum. There are bits and pieces of governance, and we'll come to that later, but the overall framework is not there, and that's, I think, a threat. And if we are discussing inevitability, I would hope that we can achieve the inevitability of having a conversation on governance. We do need to push for governance because this will simply not go away by not discussing it. I mean, there are cowboys out there that are already selling credits, that are already marketing this, and if we just do not discuss it, they won't go away.
If I understood you correctly, you said the United States and Saudi Arabia were against this
Yes.
resolution. Laura, you followed this debate probably as well. Or
Artie did it better.
Artie,
was way more informed than I was.
who can comment on these powers? What is happening there? Why are people...
It's really
Well, I was in Nairobi at the UNEA meeting, so I think also in one sense, what was on the table was very banal. You might almost think, we were not talking about the biggest questions around SRM. We were not saying, should we do research? Should this technology be developed? Should it be deployed? It was simply, as Arthur was also saying, the initial resolution suggested that there should be an expert group set up simply to do an assessment of, and it was not clear exactly how broad that assessment would be, risks, benefits of SRM. That did not go very far because there was general pushback on the idea that there should be an expert group. What kinds of expertise should be considered relevant? Is it only narrow climate risks? Is it about geopolitics? Is it about human rights? Is it what the breadth of expertise was contested? What kind of information should be assessed? Is it just, again, could be a whole range of things that SRM impacts. So the expert group idea was very rapidly put aside, and it came down to simply a repository of information. UNEP would have this in repository of information.
So without getting in too much detail about
Yes.
this
Yeah,
line, but just the forces at play here. Why is the United States and why is Saudi Arabia against such a...
Because for the US, it's very inconvenient to have any sort of even the most minimal multilateral oversight over SRM research. So what the US argued is that there is a perfect international body where dialogue and conversation about SRM should take place, and that is something that an acronym, another one that no one had heard of about a week before Nairobi, which was the World Climate Research Program under the WMO, the WCPR, and everybody was Googling, including EU negotiators and others, to say, what is this entity? Because it's a narrow climate science research body under the WMO. It has no mandate to consider politics and governance and human rights or any of the issues around SRM. It's about climate science, and it's a group of climate scientists. And the US said that's where, if there's to be any global conversation, it should be there. And meanwhile, actually what the US said is, let's do the science first.
But
policy later, governance later.
This is where UNEP is for, right? What you just explained. It should be a UNEP.
UNEP is the UN body with the mandate to address all matters environmental, right? It's a coordinating body. If there's to be a repository, it would be a logical place to have a repository. So for the US to say we don't, but I think the core issue, as we also discussed a little bit at dinner, is there's complete mistrust between countries around this issue. So the African group of countries also did not eventually go for this, because there was all kinds of fight even about who would do what with this information. So there was even this most minimal sounding requirement that UNEP would produce a synthesis report on the basis of this information. And nobody trusted UNEP to produce, because you don't know how it's going to be framed. Yeah. Language matters. We talk about shifting from management to modification. Why? Because language matters. We don't want to be seen to be managing solar radiation modification,
I'm curious, Helene, how do you perceive this development?
Yeah, I mean, it's not unexpected. I think, I mean, if we're talking about governance, we're also talking about research governance, right? So when do you, are you allowed to do research? When are you allowed to do an experiment, right? Outside, but even in labs, even modeling. Another UNEP report that I was part of, One Atmosphere, on SRM, was also, there was big debates on that. So suppose you do a modeling experiment, right? You run a model on where you simulate SRM basically in a computer model. There's a lot of publications on that, and some of them are really poorly done. Right? So it's a very simplistic model that basically just does something with the watt per square meters, and that's it. It doesn't look at anything else. And lo and behold, the temperature goes down. Great, it works. Right? So the big news is, model shows it works. Is that responsible research? Not really, right? So it's because you don't frame it, you don't really say this is actually very limited. I mean, they say it in some terms, but that doesn't make news. So there's a responsibility of researchers as well to do this in a good way, and to communicate it in a good way, and that in the past hasn't always happened. Also, another anecdote on sort of assessing the literature on this in the 1.5 Degrees report, 2017-2018, we were assessing all these papers, and there was enormous amounts of literature on SRM in good journals, right? Nature, Climate Change, and things like that. But actually, a lot of it was basically viewpoints by researchers on SRM. And at some point we were wondering, are we assessing research results, or are we assessing opinions of researchers on SRM? So we decided to not assess any of the literature that were viewpoints, but only focus on research results.
And then there was little research left, or?
No, there was still a lot left, yeah. But because there's a lot of funding for it, right? I mean, that wasn't mentioned before. Why do researchers do this? Because they can have they have their own research field, and they find it interesting out of curiosity, and sometimes out of motivation, but also because there's funding available.
That's something that I want to, if I may, that's something that really struck to me when I was researching the last article I wrote about this, like how we already talked about the US, but the tech people in the US are really, really powerful, and they really believe in this techno fix, how it's often called, and they are big funders of this research, and the research groups are growing, and like I think just 4 years ago there were on a couple of universities a couple of persons doing research, and now there are whole research groups doing the research. And also when I'm talking with my friends or family about this topic, they are really confused why I'm making such a fuss about just doing the research. But doing the research is where all the fuss is now about, because when you have the answers, you you're already halfway in it. So that's really a thing that makes this really big topic. And also one remark I wanted to make, I don't know if this is clear to the public, but the governance thing is also very important, because it's not like a switch going on and off, like it's not doing something today and then we decided, okay, this is it, but it's something we have to do for decades. It's a really big thing. It's not it's not like we pull up one plane and then it's done. Now we have to pull up hundreds or maybe thousands of planes for decades. So it's not, it's a really big thing. I don't know if that was a really clear. But
Let's see if there is any questions from the audience. Who has a question on the discussion so far? I come to you in a moment. We start here. Your name and a question.
Hi, my name is Thijs, and I was wondering if scientists that are skeptical about SRM decide not to do research, isn't it likely to get skewed between the scientists that are skeptical and the scientists that are positive, and that they keep on doing research while there isn't really an image showing like, okay, there might be a danger, or there might be a negative consequence as well?
I don't know really if you're looking at me or the other ones.
Anyone?
But
Anyone? Yeah.
Who wants? Go ahead.
I mean, that's why I indicated that if we need governance also on the research side, on setting the agenda for research, on determining what sort of research can be done and what sort of research can't be done. And it starts there. We've been discussing over the last 15 minutes, as soon as you start doing research and you do not regulate it, whatever develops blooms at the end. I mean, I call that nowadays, since I saw the movie Oppenheimer, doing an Oppenheimer. I mean, once you develop the technology, sooner or later it will be used. And it's that sort of inevitability that we want to avoid. So we need a governance discussion to become inevitable right now and not 5 years down the line, because we're at crossroads now. And it's now that the global community needs to make up its mind on whether or not to go down this path. And I very much agree with Helene that every minute we spend on discussing this without making a decision, that's a waste of time. And one of the arguments for SRM by the proponents is that it will help us to buy time so that we can get to net zero. No, it's wasting time, because all these discussions, without coming to a conclusion and to a governance decision on it, is actually a lost opportunity on mitigation, on all the things that we should be doing.
Just to make sure, who hasn't seen Oppenheimer? 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5? Yes, perfect, no problem. Also not seen it. Oppenheimer is a movie, the blockbuster movie about the nuclear developments just before World War II, during World War II, where Ruben is his first name. Is it correct? Ruben Oppenheimer? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Who knows? Ruben? Robert.
Robert.
Robert. Thanks, Oppenheimer.
Maybe on this question, I think you're right, and I think it goes for every technology. It also goes for wind energy, for heat grids or whatever. The people working on the technology are generally in favor of it. And maybe with SRM less, right? People who are working on it are, they know how. They're also hesitant to use it because they see the risks as well. I think that's generally.
That was also one of the topics on the UNEA discussions, right? Because Some countries want to research the risks, and some countries want to research the possibilities. That's a whole different starting point. So, yeah.
Artie, your addition?
Yes. No, I think a little bit it's been discussed. What is the problem with saying, let's just do the research, right? But I think exactly also as you were saying, what kind of research has to be done is a crucial issue. And I think the core question also is what kind of research will tell us what we need to know. So we can say academic freedom and let's just do the research. But are we talking about climate modeling? Are we talking about small outdoor experiments? Are we talking about large scale outdoor experiments? Essentially, if you want to have a planetary scale impact, you need planetary scale experimentation, and that too for a long duration of time, right? So it's planetary scale experimentation is like deploying. So without that, over an extended period of time, we will not actually know what we want to know. So in light of that, to say, let's just do the research, we have to be aware of the political risks of that position, the moral dilemma facing a scientist. So we saw the cowboys of Make Sunsets, and we can make fun of them or whatever, but it signals something. And the question, even SRM advocates have distanced themselves from these folks, but we need to ask ourselves whose research is fueling this. Yeah. And you can look at their website. It's David Keith and other fathers of, I won't describe David Keith. But anyway, the fathers of SRM and their research, it fuels it. So we need to ask the question, Oppenheimer and otherwise, what will the research be used for and by whom?
Thijs, it was a good question. It spins a lot of debate. Arthur, what's your addition on it?
Well, I just wanted to point out that the Dutch position, the government position on research is that we would allow research on SRM focusing on better understanding the risks. We would allow research in a lab on modeling basis, definitely not outdoor experiments, let alone on a planetary scale.
Right.
But no, that's beyond what we would allow from a Dutch perspective. But again, that's not everybody's, because the US is heavily investing in this, and others are heavily investing in this. Not only because of a belief in technological fixes, but I mean, if you can have this and you can create the illusion that it works, it allows you as a fossil fuel rich country to continue to export your stuff and to burn your stocks and sell your stocks before we come to a different situation. So it's fossil fuel power driving this debate. It's the cowboys, the tech cowboys, and Make Sunsets. Yes, some people are now distancing themselves from Make Sunsets because they were caught. But there are many other cowboys out there that have not yet been caught, and they are undertaking exactly the same activities. Yeah, and a third one, and we'll come to that, is the military and the defense domain, which is also an important driver of this research agenda. We should not forget that.
Why? Let's do a short answer to that. Why?
Because you can use it as a weapon. I mean, as we heard in the scary scenario that Jeroen told us, I mean, this can be developed under the narrative of climate concern and climate change, but sooner or later it might become a weapon. It might influence your access to natural resources, and it might deny your enemies access to natural resources. And in a world that is becoming more and more natural resource scarce, that temptation is growing, and we already see that in the US agenda, in India's agenda, and others.
I'm looking at the time. I think we should move along. Let's do one. You had your hand up as well. Let's do a short question, short answer.
Well, I thought even if we try the energy transfer, but it fails, wouldn't it be good you had done the research? That, like when with anti-conception, is it that if the pill and the condoms have failed, it's nice you still have abortion, though you don't want abortion. You don't want this GRM, but still, it's nice to have it ready. I think.
When you need it, right?
When you need
Yeah.
it, that you don't have to start the research then when everything has failed.
A short, maybe it's difficult, but a short answer to that. Who wants? Helene.
Yeah, maybe I can answer that from the perspective of an innovation researcher. I work in an innovation science group. Technology doesn't work that way. That you have it, that you keep it on a shelf, and you take it off when you need it. It always develops in a social context. You need to know what you're doing. You need to have experimented at a very large scale before you can really use it. Because otherwise it tends to bite back. And you may know what to do, and we know sort of what to do since the Crutzen article of 2006, but you may not know how to do it responsibly. And
Let's move on. Thanks for your brief answer. It's a good question. We move on. We already mentioned Oppenheimer, the movie, and we will dive a little bit more in that direction with a guest who was joining us through Zoom. You can maybe briefly sit down. We get you back here on stage in a moment for the second round of the panel. Yeah, it's a topic we can easily spend evenings with, so we'll see how it turns out. She's a research fellow at the University of Leeds in the UK. She's herself from the United States of America, and her current project examines parallels between nuclear weapons governance and emerging governance of solar geoengineering technology, and specifically stratospheric aerosol injection. So that's the high atmosphere layers where you inject then aerosols. It's like what volcanoes do naturally when they erupt. Her name is Danielle Young, and we will see her in the screen. Danielle, good evening.
Hello. I think there might be a slight delay. Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly fine. Thanks.
Okay, good. I think there's a slight lag with the video, but it should be fine. Thanks for having me. And there's many points in the discussion so far I've wanted to jump in on. So there's lots to kind of respond to here. And I'm glad that Oppenheimer was raised as a potential touchstone because it's a good link to the direction that my research has gone in. I think one of the first points I'd like to make is that there's been a lot of discussion here about scientific research and also governance. But what geoengineering research and nuclear is that once scientists develop a technology, that doesn't mean that they'll be in charge of the decision making about how it's used and implemented. And in fact, they're often quite quickly cut out of the decision making loop, especially if they don't go along with the sort of power dynamics of decision makers and what they're interested in.
So
this is something we certainly saw with nuclear technology.
Daniel, just to interrupt you briefly, you were a bit interrupted, but what you were what you were saying, if I just to check if I heard you correctly, is that when you're a scientist, your research at some point will be taken over by policymakers. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yes, that there is a tendency to. I'm turning my camera off because I think that'll help with the delay.
Perfect.
There's a tendency to speak about this as though decision making will be driven by scientists and scientific assessments of when the technology should be used. And I'd like to caution against that. That's not historically what we see with technologies, particularly with such massive potential political implications. But also, I think that this is a good point to sort of address some of the things that have been raised here. We've talked a lot about the need for governance, but as somebody who studies international politics, one of my concerns is that even if you develop an effective governance regime, it won't matter that much.
Why?
Because especially when you're talking about things like stratospheric aerosol injection, the only actors that are realistically capable of starting and maintaining an SAI program over the assessments right now are saying it would be a multi-century commitment if you started, are countries with advanced aerospace industries or the major nuclear powers. And if they choose not to be restrained by a governance system, there's very little that can be done about it. I mean, people talk about this in terms of the UN Security Council. All of those countries have a veto. So this is one of the issues with relying too much even on international law and governance in this space. And one of the things I'd like to bring up here is that Jeroen started off with an interesting kind of thought exercise about India being a starting point here. And a lot of people do this, and that makes sense because they are quite vulnerable to climate change. But my research and way of thinking suggests, and also because I have a history of working in US politics, I think that the most likely unilateral actor is the United States. They, first of all, we talk a lot about the idea of global coordinated efforts out rolling out SRM, because you would need that unless you have the logistical capacity of the US military. It has hundreds of overseas bases with airstrips. Mm-hmm. It has the latent industrial capacity to do this itself if it wants to. There's a push for the US to establish itself as a responsible climate leader, because it's been a laggard in this space for a couple of decades. But the climate leadership that it may come up with is not necessarily the one that people have in mind. And this is particularly the case because the US military does take change very seriously, and they've talked about climate change as a threat multiplier that they want to address. But they have a massive carbon footprint, and realistically, the only way that they can reduce it is to reduce the size of the military, which is not the direction that the US is going in. In late 2023, they announced a $1.5 trillion plan to upgrade and expand the nuclear arsenal, including a $100 billion plan to fill 4 inland nuclear silos in the US with new and more nuclear bombs, in a direction of a larger military rather than a smaller. And that leads us to a situation in which the option for the US military to take climate change seriously is to develop SRM.
So that's
to
the
have
only
a weapon to point.
So what you're saying is that the US will never align with an international treaty to do it in a let's say in a honest, in a well thought of manner, that they will just push through whatever happens?
I don't think that's necessarily inevitable, but that is a trajectory that is emerging.
Sounds a bit scary.
It is scary. At the UNEA 6 talks that people have talked about here, it was the US, Saudi Arabia, and Japan that were saying, first of all, they only want a scientific assessment, and second, let them handle the governance themselves. So you already see this happening in this space. But one of the issues with climate is that it's quite difficult to come up with interventions that a policymaker can take credit for on a politically relevant timeline. If you have a situation in which there's a climate emergency, a particularly bad wildfire season, etc., you're close to an election, you could have a situation in which SRM is something that a politician can do and that they can point to as a quick action. And people talk about the timeline for development of SRM in terms of potential decades. But as a reminder, the Manhattan Project, which was an almost inconceivably huge industrial project, took 2 years. If the US brought its sort of latent industrial capacity to bear on getting this program going, it could do it quite quickly. And the Department of Energy, which houses nuclear technology in the US, has already said that they are using their internal climate models to answer national security questions using climate engineering models. So this is not just about the environment. Yeah. Also, if you know much about the history of military dynamics and kind of breakdowns in cooperation, I find it very unlikely that the US will let another country claim control over the atmosphere. So the decision-making, people are assessing this in terms of environmental costs and benefits, which is important, but the decision-making is unlikely to be primarily led by environmental concerns. If that was how we made decisions, we wouldn't have the climate crisis problem that we have now.
Daniel, Daniel, I'm curious if you're based in the UK, is that correct?
Yes, that's where I am now.
If you talk to European policymakers and you share this story, it's to me it's kind of a scary story. But if you share it to European policymakers, how do they react, or what do you advise them?
I think that just to put this but I think that Europeans tend to be more cautious and responsible, to be honest. I think, like, just anecdotally, a couple of weeks ago, I had some friends visiting me from the US, one of whom recently left his job as a communications director for a senator. And when I was talking to him about my research, he's a communications director for a US senator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when I was talking to him about my research, I was talking about how there are some scientists who work in this that get concerned, like when people talk about possibly turning the sky white, because they say that that would be overdoing it, that would be too much, it wouldn't be beneficial for the environment. And it was getting to the point, but he got there before me. He's like, yeah, but if you're a politician and you want to do this, you want it to be clear to people that you've done it. He said, I would put it in skywriting, like SAI brought to you by Senator so-and-so.
It's a sponsor.
So I think that there's a real division in terms of even thinking through response here.
The connection is not sponsored, it seems.
All right, now here we go. I think it's come back.
All right. Maybe as a final remark, let's round it up. We can hear you quite well, but it's maybe it's enough for now. If we do the final question, what would you want to give us here at the audience here in Amsterdam as a takeaway from what you just shared? What is the way forward here?
I think that people need to be more aware of SRM in the context of international political instability. I know that there are concerns about sort of raising this idea to people, but I think that a lot of people, for example, are not aware that nuclear arms control is collapsing. And something like SRM could be drawn into the security politics of that. So it's just to be aware of this, not just in terms of, is this good for the environment or is it bad? But what is the greater international arena in which these discussions will be taking place? So don't just think about this in terms of good or bad for the environment, because I don't think that that's how the decision makers will approach this, at least primarily.
Thanks a lot for sharing that with us, Danielle Young. So, panelists, please get back to your spots. Just so you know, I'm looking at the draaiboek for this evening. We are quite a bit over time already. We will end it at least before, let's say, 10 to 10 or something. That's the time probably we will end up with. So you know if you have any connections or other meetings. I don't know what your plans are on a Monday evening? Yeah, Monday. Sorry. All right, let's get back to it. What a topic, eh? Incredible.
Mm-hmm.
My head is a bit full. How does this work for you? For you, it's not new what you hear, or is it new what you hear, Arthur?
No, it's not new, and I've heard Danielle speak about this earlier, of course, because she has been talking to European policymakers, and I very much agree with it. And you can then either be sad and hide and wait for things to happen, but we need to come up with a solution. And although I'm very much aware that this is not just an environmental debate, I do think that we should try to start the debate on governance from that angle, but aware of the fact that it has ramifications far beyond the environment domain. And if I'm talking about giving UNEP a role in analyzing governance and developing a framework for governance, that can also mean that they look at the military conventions that we have, like NMOD or other stuff that is relevant in this domain, and that should be taken into account. And it's not UNEP being or overseeing the ultimate governance outcome, but they could have a role in initial debates and in initial development of framework. And that's, I think, the only thing that you can do from my perspective as a European policymaker from a Ministry of Environment. Where do I start? Hearing Daniela, I start with UNEP, and that's all I think that we can do. And that at least.
But if I understood you correctly, before UNEP got cancelled, let's so say, by the US, or is it a bit too?
Yes. So we are now thinking about different strategies to sort of not go through the front door at UNEP, but maybe there's a back door to getting UNEP involved and having this debate. And we might want to even think about doing the job that we wanted UNEP to do ourselves, and then put it on the table in order to have all those parties that you want at the table that now are just reluctant, like the US, to bring them to the table, because otherwise it will go somewhere they don't want it to go.
Yeah. So the idea of this last part of the panel is to explore what is needed in terms of governance to move ahead. Ati, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think I've also heard Daniela speak, and I completely agree. This goes way beyond a climate and environment issue. And therefore, I think, of course, UNEP has a mandate on the environmental front, but UNEP alone cannot govern the use and deployment of this technology. In fact, that is the core rationale for the call for a non-use agreement. And basically, it's a group of 500 or more scientists have signed a call calling for basically suggesting that there should be non-use, a stop on technology development of this, and also non-use.
Is there a link between UNEP and this non-use agreement, or is it?
I mean, essentially, one of the core reasons why is because deployment of SRM can never be governed in a fair and inclusive manner through any UN body.
Okay.
UNEP is the least of it. We have the United Nations General Assembly. It has no binding powers. We have the Security Council, which we heard about, the only sort of powerful UN agency which has 5 countries, the ones who could potentially deploy SRM, have a veto right. They will never agree to place a planet-altering technology under the control of a United Nations, which is essentially giving the global south developing countries a majority. It functions on a one country, one vote system. The US will never place planet-altering technologies under the control of, they don't even want a repository of information under UNEP. There's no question. That is a core reason why we call for a non-use agreement. Because the essential question... But the non-use
agreement, will that then turn out
because I think the question for the citizens of, essentially the question is who will decide about SRM, about planet-altering technologies. It will be essentially a small group of major powers. And are we okay with that? And if you're not okay with that, then the governance way forward is basically taking this technology off the table. And now you will, of course, ask, how is that feasible? How can we rein in the US if it's all gung-ho and ready to go? The only way, we have the better argument, and there could be normative change. It can come from different, can come from the bottom up, grass. Essentially, we need to shift the conversation from saying, yes, this is something we need, to saying this is so dangerous, it needs to be taken off the table. If the European Union were to ally with the African Union, we would have a majority, at least to have a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly. It's not binding, it can't reign in the United States, but it has normative power. And if enough of the world says no to this technology, it's simply too risky, it will never be used for the benefit of the vulnerable and the poor and all of those rationales that are put forward, it will get tied into the fraught geopolitics of our world. Do we want to live in that world, a solar geoengineered world where we cannot get out of it, multi-generational? So if we don't want to, the only option is to try with whatever means there are available to say we need that norm change. And it can come from different places.
Elaine, I'm curious, you you are in the scientific world as well. A non-use agreement, do you support it? How's your view on that?
So I personally think it's a good idea. I didn't sign the petition because I never signed petitions. Also because as an IPCC author, I want to be, I don't want to put myself in a camp. So that's a decision, and that's why. But yeah, I think there's a lot of good reasons to be extremely careful about this. And I didn't know Danielle. Thank you so much, Danielle, for this, because it was very informative. I learned a lot. But yeah, in general, with these, with technology, I think it really goes in general. It always has more side effects than you think, and especially these large-scale technologies in the wrong hands, they can do way more damage than. And it goes beyond, the initial aim of the technology. So yeah, I think we need to be extremely careful about it.
But just to understand, do you think that the direction of a non-use agreement is the only way out, or do you see other trajectories?
Well,
forward?
I think one key thing that Artie was hinting at is sort of the role of trust in the international governance systems, right? And we see that trust between countries, between even the European Union and African Union countries, is very low, right? Because we've seen decades of, basically broken promises. And I don't know if this could be a theme where they could be, where they realize they're on the same side and they could collaborate more. I don't know, Arthur, if you have comments on that, but maybe that I agree that this might be necessary, and indeed, then you have the moral higher ground, and you send a very clear signal that. I mean, the US is very powerful in international governance, but it doesn't always get its way. And if it stands alone, there is pressure to change something. So.
What Helene just asked, how's your view on that?
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, and I also like the suggestion for the EU to tie up with the African group. The African group has already.
The African group is
the African group is the group of African countries, and they speak with one voice in UN meetings, and they have already expressed that they support a non-use agreement. And in the UNEA discussions, we were this far apart, but given the mistrust that there is in this debate, even those that were more or less in the same camp, they do not exactly understand each other and trust each other, and they did not want it. They did not want the EU to compromise or to have this repository, because they would see a repository as being enabling this technology, while we would see it as a source of information that would help us prevent this thing from flourishing. That's two ways of phrasing the same ambition, more or less. So I think it's a viable way forward. But the main thing is to get the EU to speak with one voice. And there, I think that's already challenging enough for now. Because we do have differences of opinion in Europe, we do not see a lot of European countries that are even starting to think about this. It's only a handful. And even
do you mean a handful of countries only has a position in it, and the other countries don't know?
Exactly. Okay. And even within that handful of countries, you can already see differences. And Germany is far more cautious than France, for example, and the Netherlands maybe a little bit in between. But from bringing 27 of those opinions together is already difficult enough, as we all know, on all sorts of topics, let alone a touchy one like this. And then talk to the African group. We have homework to do, but we need to do it, and we need to do it fast. That's for sure.
Laura, how's your view on this direction of a non-use agreement?
I think it's a powerful way of saying no, but from my point of view, like the arguments of the non-use people are always the same, and they're very, very valid. Don't question me on that, but they're always the same. And the arguments on the people who do the research or want to know more, they're constantly changing. Like we want to know more about food security because there's less sun coming down, and we want to know more about that. Oh, and we now know something about that, and then we move on to other topics. So there's a lot of dynamics going on, and I think these both camps are not in the same ballpark, if you know what I mean. Like the non-use way is a good is a really powerful saying, but it's like my 2-year-old stamping on the floor, constantly saying the same. But sorry.
And you mean in the end?
No. I'm happy to be a 2-year-old.
No, but like I don't know if it's helpful. That's the.
Can I respond?
Yeah, the 2-year-old.
No, I just would like to say that I wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
That our arguments have not changed.
Yeah.
That our arguments remain the
and
same.
still valid.
Because. I mean, I have not changed my view in the last 2 years. Non-use idea came up in January 2022 for a set of, 3 sets of, we haven't really fully had the chance to explore exactly why, etc. But our reasons remain exact. Our concerns are the same. I find it very problematic that the advocacy side's arguments continue to change. And in fact, I mean, that is where the problem lies.
But because, just back to Lara, why do you think then it's a bad thing that it looks like a 2-year-old?
No, it's not. It's like the. Sorry, I love my 2-year-old. So it's no, it's not a bad thing.
Are very wise.
The discussion is not. Yeah.
Evolving.
But can I just? Yeah, I think that is actually the point, because if we cut down to the essence of it, the reasons why we call for a non-use agreement, those unknowable and unacceptable risks to the climate system, which we cannot know till we've actually tried it at scale for a sustained period of time. We cannot know. We could make the climate crisis and impacts much worse. And this is acknowledged. There's no way to reduce that uncertainty. That's a clear, very compelling risk. Then there's the second argument is it can never be governed in a fair and inclusive manner. We would leave it to a few small, powerful actors, and there are winners and losers from this. That is also agreed. This technology can never be used in a way where everybody is a winner. We cannot just turn the thermostat down to exactly this temperature, which is an ideal temperature, and only talking temperature for all. There will be differences in the ideal temperature, let alone impacts on precipitation, food systems, all of which will be regionally unequally distributed, and we don't know what they will be before it actually happens. So this thing can never be governed for the greater good of all by some global rational decision maker who's going to be making these decisions for the benefit of all humanity. That's not how it's going to play out. That conviction has not changed in the last 2 years. Nor have the regionally unequal impacts. And the third thing is the mitigation deterrence. Like we said, in the next few years, we need to bend that emission curve, and everybody knows that. And we move our eye away from that. It is absolutely a dangerous risk that we do that. And so that argument hasn't changed. Whereas, let me just say, the other side's arguments continue to change, because initially, it's like we are completely failing, we will never do enough, and therefore we need SRM. We cannot reduce our emissions quickly enough. Now the argument, just one example, now the argument is, even if we go to zero emissions tomorrow, we could be super ambitious and successful. Of course, we won't go to zero emissions tomorrow, but even if we do, we still need SRM. The conclusion is the same always. We need SRM. The political realities will keep changing, and they will be used to justify SRM. And I could give many other examples of that changing argument. And I think that's a big problem. Sometimes
also, but in the discussion, it feels, the pro side feels more dynamic. And that's like...
As a journalist as well, I reckon, right? Because you have a different story. It's the same story for 2 years already, Aki. It's a bit boring for you to write an article
that's-
about it
that's
every
true.
time again. I can imagine. Okay, let's see if there are questions from you guys here on this topic. Who has a question? Your name and the question, please.
Hi, my name is Dylan. Thank you for the discussion. Yeah, my question is whether I perceive the dilemma in the right way. So on the one hand, I hear you talk about let's not spend many minutes discussing this because it's a distraction. So maybe keep it within the smaller pockets in where it is discussed now. And on the other hand, I hear you discuss the hope for normative change, for bottom-up pressure. So how do we solve this dilemma? Do we need to put a lot of air into the discussion with the risk of the fire burning higher, or not?
Anyone?
I can't see where you're pointing.
At anybody who wants to take it up.
I think that's a fair description of the dilemma. And dilemmas are usually not easily solved, so I don't have a clear answer to that. But as I said in the first session, I think there is an inevitability of having a conversation on this because it's not going away. So staying within our small pockets, as you call it, and isolated discussions, keeping our heads down, is not going to last, because it will be deployed in that case by entrepreneurs, by cowboys that go. That it's free for all then, and then we're already in big trouble, and we will be in a situation that we cannot control anymore. So yeah, we should probably have the debate and argue for adequate regulation, whether that's a non-use agreement or whether that's the right term, but building up normative pressure to and engage as many countries and actors as possible, I think is the only way forward.
Perfect. Thanks for the question, Dylan. Go ahead.
Yeah, a very strange question. All the time that I'm hearing about climate, I'm hearing about models. And I've been looking at the time series of NOAA of what is the data on the Earth. And I'm questioning, is there enough looked at those data, because they are very odd if you are examining them. And I have the question, if it all is needed so much.
If SRM is needed anyhow.
Looking at the current data of the Earth and the changes in the climate.
Is SRM really needed? That's the question, right? Yeah. Who wants to take that up?
No, it's not needed because we can prevent climate change without using SRM. It's possible. That's what all IPCC report says. It is very necessary to do something about climate change because we're seeing rising temperatures and dire consequences.
Just a short addition.
The one odd thing that I saw that is that it isn't that the summers get hotter. It's more that the winters gets milder, and I see much changes at the North Pole and not so much at the middle.
Maybe a short answer.
Yeah, if we want to go into a debate on whether,
If you have a short answer, it could be. Otherwise,
yeah, I
we
mean
leave
that there's higher temperature rises in the north along the poles compared to the other latitudes. It has a climate physical cause. Yeah, so that's completely in line with what you would expect if you increase your greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere.
Perfect. Let's leave it there for now, this topic. Other questions? Thanks for the question. Other questions on SRM, governance, futures ahead?
Hello, my name is Giel, and 6 years ago I was doing a scientific writing course, and that was the first time this topic came across my mind. I found it very interesting, and the person who wrote an essay about it was arguing for using it. Now, a couple of years later, I've been trying to do a lot of great impact for the environment in my work. So that also loops back to your argument if we have to discuss it right now, right? But when I saw this topic that it will be discussed tonight, I was thinking about a couple of months ago in Dubai there was heavy rain, and was it also due to the fact of using, yeah, what we are discussing now? So that is the first question I have.
Was the heavy rain in Dubai related to geoengineering? Is that the question? Or was it something else? Any?
Well, yeah, I also had the same question because it was all over the news. I talked with the cloud scientists in Delft who know everything about these. This is more like cloud seeding, if it was the case. But this thing in Dubai was a way bigger. I don't know how do you call that? A way bigger
event.
Cloud event. It was huge. Like it could have started with a cloud seeding event, and if you would do this like SAI, then it would be not about clouds and rain, but it would be about a little bit of particles in the stratosphere. So that's not the same. So the connection that was also in lots of news outlets about that rain and being it's technically induced, that was not the case.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry.
It's wait a minute, just with the microphone. Just shorten your question as much as possible, please.
But the follow-up question was: do we need, a minor or maybe a not so minor, complication of using those kind of techniques to get people around the topic about why don't we just stop using all those things?
I don't know. Yeah, sorry.
Someone else wants to answer?
Well, I think one of the differences between cloud seeding and the things that we are discussing now in solar radiation modification is the scale. I mean, if we are talking solar radiation modification, we're talking internationally, almost by definition, planetary by definition, and cloud seeding is probably having effects at a regional scale. So it might affect Dubai's neighbors in your example, but that's a whole different debate. An interesting one, but a different debate.
Okay, let's see if there is a final question, or maybe, yeah, let's go for. Let's check. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a final? Let's do two questions. You have a question. You have a question. I move to you first, and then we go there for the last question.
Thanks. I wonder what the driving factors are at the moment. You said like there's a lot of agreement against it, against the research and development, but next to the cowboys, as you called them, it's like who are the driving forces right now? Countries or media?
Driving forces. Maybe a question for a long answer, but maybe we try to keep it a bit of a concise answer. Who wants to answer it?
I think a lot of the funding for SRM, the original push and the continued push is basically it's coming a lot from private funding, Silicon Valley investors, mainly in the United States. Still a small group, that's where it started. There's some government funding from the US, and the UK has recently launched a research program, but essentially it's concentrated largely US, UK, a few climate scientists funded by tech billionaires and investors, Silicon Valley.
Thanks. Here, final question.
Good evening. My question is about the consequences it will have for the surrounding countries. If you're using it in one area, for example, won't it have another effect on the surrounding areas?
Who wants to answer?
Yeah, so we're talking here about really global technologies. So one country could deploy it, but it would have global consequences. So, for instance, if you employ stratospheric aerosol injection, you might lower the temperature globally. But as Artie said before, the impacts will be different in different places, and it might affect, the rainfall in this country, it might affect temperatures there, or so. And those consequences, there's some modeling done to evaluate that, and I think that sort of field is improving in terms of quality, but it's it will have unequal consequences that we will never fully know until we actually do it.
Thanks for this answer, Helene. Let's start with giving them a big round of applause, all the panelists. Thank you. So we move to the end of the evening. Yeah, just take your seat there, it's fine. We started this evening with, let's say, a scenario going forward in time. Jeroen Oomen shared his scenario, or one of the possible scenarios, with us. It was maybe not the most optimistic scenario. Jeroen, can you come forward to share maybe some last words? How did you experience this evening?
Yeah, pretty thankless job having to summarize whatever happened here tonight, because it was incredibly rich and I made a lot of notes. But I think I kind of want to enter that summary through your question. Like, do we let air into this discussion? And I think the answer to that question sort of was in the room and at the tables. Because I think Arthur said it, it's inevitable. It's inevitable that there is air in this discussion. The real question is, who lets in the air into discussion and under what conditions? And I think we should really listen very carefully to what Danielle said about military dreams fueling geoengineering research. And in that sense, it's really good for you to realize that actually the causal relationship between geoengineering and climate science is the other way around than you might think. It was not that fears about climate change drew us into geoengineering dreams. It was that the militaries of the US and of Soviet Russia in the 50s and 60s dreamed about climate and weather control, and that's how we got our climate science as we knew it. So that dream has always been there. And I think that really needs you, that you really need to think about that when we're talking about shifting the conversation, as Arti said. Because who is doing the shifting and how are we doing the shifting? What is the role that our science plays in that? And I think we saw all kinds of ways that that happens today, and I can't take too much time to give my 2 cents on that. But I think that is the question. How do we shift? Who shifts and who has the power to demarcate what we talk about? And that is, I think, why we really wanted to have this conversation with you. And I learned a lot from all of our panelists. So thank you very much, and I'll close it there.
Thank you. So just a short note. Thank you for joining this evening. And this conversation was recorded, so you can watch it back later. And if you want to put some air in it, you can share it with other people if you want to. You can also become a friend of Pakhuis de Zwijger to get some extra funding for Pakhuis to make more interesting programs like this, and also sign up for a newsletter for future events that you can do through the newsletter. I hope you had a good evening, that was well spent, and that you dried up a bit, spending some time inside here, and hopefully see you next time. Thank you. Oh yeah, and let's give a big round of applause for Rico and Cecile for